What will remain of you once you're no longer here? Once you have joined the majority and slipped from this somewhat material realm? Besides memories, what will remain of you once you're no longer here? For a somewhat enormous segment of my early adult life, this was something that was of great importance to me. It provided me with a great deal of somewhat sleepless nights and provided an almost ever-present anxiety within the background of my day-to-day life. Although I've seemingly always, in a way, kind of known that some ineffable part of me remains in some way, that this is not the end. Once we close our eyes and draw our last breath, some part of us continues. But what stays here? What stays present for those who are still alive and for those who are yet to come? What can I provide for them? It's funny to look back at how much thought I gave to this idea, but it is something that even to this day that I attempt to pay some kind of credence to. This was existentially important to me for a period of time. I seemingly struggled, and perhaps you can relate, I seemingly struggled with the idea that once I was dead, that over time, perhaps very quickly, I would inevitably fall into complete obscurity and oblivion, that not even memory of me would remain. How on earth was I supposed to last? How on earth was I supposed to make some kind of mark that stretches past my time here? I discovered a poem early in my teenage years. It was by Shelley, and it's a very short poem. It's called Ozymandias. I'll save all of you for me reading the poem. What happens is basically a lone traveler is in the desert and they come across a monument, and it was set up by a king, a ruler, one who had immense power in his time, but there is a small pedestal on this monument that basically says, look at this, look at what I have done, look at all of the great things I have done, and despair, for even this does not last. It ends with these immortal lines. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. There are many meanings ascribed to this poem, and a lot of it has to do with, civilization, kingdoms, and rulers, but I took a more individual, existentially angsty meaning from this poem, one that truly fed into this anxiety. What chance do I have if not even the great works of kings can remain? What could be me, Douglas Batchelor's best hope, their only hope of surviving the ravages of time and memory? The answer was incredibly simple. The greatest way of doing this is to not appeal to the minds of humanity, but to touch their heart, to touch their soul in some way. And the greatest way of doing this is through art, through some kind of artistic project or a series of artistic projects that speaks to that ineffable part of us, to the ever hungry and unslaked human spirit and passions. The best chance that I have, somebody who seemingly came from almost nothing, could potentially create something that in a way could live close to forever. And so that's what happened. My 20s and half of my 30s was spent in pursuit of some way of finding the art that could potentially do this. And for a time, I called myself a filmmaker. For a time, I called myself a screenwriter. Beyond that, I filled my life with the consumption and constant analysis of great art, as well as what makes them great. Maddeningly, I attempted to try and find the thing, the medium that I could devote myself to entirely, to create, with the hopes that someday I would produce that timeless work of pure art, the art that will live beyond me. Something perhaps that could join the ranks, the plays of Shakespeare, the brushstrokes of Van Gogh, the monstrous words of Mary Shelley, and the piercing lens of Kubrick. I told myself, somehow I could do this. And yet, as I grew older, it's not that this anxiety diminished. It was more that I stepped outside of my circle and met more people and talked to them, not about the latest TV show that they watched, but I would ask people all the time what they were doing otherwise when they weren't at work. They weren't just trying to get through the day. And I found out that most of them were doing the same thing. Most of them were, in a way, attempting to join the ranks. This certainly made me feel less alone, but what of the art itself? As I rounded the corner of my 30th birthday, I became more enamored with looking into the story of the art as opposed to the art itself. And I found some particular things. One was that it had been, as I discovered earlier, that it was mostly people just trying their best, just doing their best to join the ranks. But that a lot of the time, initiation into the ranks is, for the most part, not in our hands. A lot of times, the work for which we wish to be known is not the thing by which we will be known. Most of the time, our art and the phenomenon which gets some of our art into the echelons of the human imagination, buried deep into the sinews, to continue well beyond the span of our limited time, seemingly has a life of its own. And one of the finest examples that comes to my mind, not just for the things that I find interesting, and not just the things on which the foundation of this show is built, comes from the collision of two mediums. One being the visual medium, but also the dispensability of a pack of playing cards. The story of the creator of this work of art, as well as the work of art itself, seems to me to be in some way miraculous. And while this work of art is, within the span of time, relatively new, I think at this point it could very well be safe to say that this specific deck of cards, which is, of course, a set of divination cards known to us as the tarot, has been, and I think will continue to be, a great work of art, and also shall continue to persist as a touchstone within Western culture. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and you are listening to What Magic Is This Podcast? A podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. And we are once more stepping into the Fool's Gallery, a place where we spotlight some important individuals that have added so much to this wonderful thing that we still call magic, and taking in an appreciation of an artist and one piece of their art. In this case, of course, it could be no other than Pamela Colman Smith and the tarot deck, which changed everything. I have been doing a lot of thinking about art lately. For the most part, the art that one, takes in with their eyes and their ears for the most part. I think the reason why this is happening should be somewhat, let's just say, if you're listening to this at a later date, this is in and around early 2026. Art seems to be, in a way, something that a lot of people are talking about a little bit more than normal. The volume on the discussion in and around art has seemingly been turned up a couple of notches, most likely as a response to certain things happening in the world. Nothing out of the normal there. Yet it all has me, thinking about the future in some way, but also thinking about my own specific brand of what I do, or I'm just going to call it my art. And looking at things, I was starting to think more so about not how I do what I do, because normally I tend to concentrate on the how of things, but just kind of what I do. And I noticed something that I have not done an episode of the Fool's Gallery in quite some time. In fact, the last time I did an episode that was centered around a specific person, it was 2 years ago. 2 whole years ago, and that was an episode that I did on Dion Fortune. All of these kind of came together, just my thoughts about art and the remembrances of the anxiety of an Ozymandian nature. And those thoughts persisted, and I asked myself, the world of Western magic, the continuum of Western magic, certainly has a lot of great artists, Austin Osman Spare, Marjorie Cameron, great artists, great artwork. But outside of our wonderful, cozy little niche here of the Western ritual magic tradition, for the most part, people don't know these folks, not unless, they go for a dive. Have we here within the West produced something that has extended beyond our lovely little cozy niche? And could I find an example of one? And even more than that, could I find that the creator of such an artwork to be worthy of being an episode unto itself? And the answer to that came very fast, obviously. I truly think that one of the finest examples of an artwork that has gone beyond its initial purpose to become something more, indeed to become a thing entirely unto itself that exists in the minds of people that even think that magic itself is bullshit. The single greatest example of this is a tarot deck, known at the time of its creation as just the tarot. Then as time went forward, as the Rider Tarot deck, and then eventually the Rider Waite Tarot deck, and then eventually as the Rider Waite Smith deck. A deck so woven into the tapestry of Western culture that, for the most part, if you ask somebody to think of a tarot deck, chances are the image that they will see in their mind is from this Rider Waite Smith deck. This is the tarot deck. How did it come to be so? But besides that, why is it that there are so many persisting myths and just so little known about, for the most part, and for my money, the main force behind how this deck had the audacity to join the ranks of great works of art? And that is the artist herself, the one responsible for what you see when you open up the box of tarot cards and take them out. It doesn't matter the words on the box. The words, they're superficial. I'm literally sitting with it. I have right here my tarot cards. It says the Rider Tarot deck. It just says the Rider Tarot deck. Doesn't say anything about Waite, doesn't say anything about Pamela Colman Smith on there. You open up that shitty, superficial box and you start going through the cards. You were immediately taking notice of the exquisite images that you have in your hand. That's why this deck is popular. It's those images. Somebody had to create them, and that somebody is Pamela Colman Smith. Chances are most of you don't know a ton about Pamela, and there's also a chance that some of you know Pamela, but also perhaps you know some of the myths that surround Pamela and her work. I would like to rectify both your lack of knowledge about Pamela, as well as to try and take apart some of the myths and the things said about Pamela in this episode. We have our work cut out for this episode because, for one, there's not a ton of information about Pamela, and the majority of Pamela's life after she produced these cards, we really don't know too much. Also, it could be said that perhaps a podcast is one of the worst ways of getting to know an artist of Pamela's caliber. I can only do so much from my end, and I shall endeavor to do so. But one of the delights that I had in doing the research for this episode was actually just looking at some of her artwork, and it's exceptional. I think it's gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's not just the things on her tarot cards. In fact, my favorite thing that she's ever done has nothing to do with the tarot cards. But also, you are listening to me. You're listening to me because I talk about magic and the occult. And for the most part, Pamela was, more than anything, she considered herself to be an artist more so than a magician. But to continue this long, rambling sentence that seemingly has no period in sight, magic and its expression is indeed art, and so Pamela herself, as well as the cards that she produced, are beyond worthy. And I would love to share the story of both with you. Let's begin. The year is 1878. The place, the city of Westminster within central London. On February 16th of that year, the world welcomed Corinne Pamela Mary Colman Smith. Of course, given time, Corinne would prefer to be called Pamela, but to her friends and family, she would be just Pam. She was an only child, and while born in England, her parents were both Americans, mostly based out of the city of Brooklyn, which was not quite yet part of New York City. Their family seems to have been well-to-do, as both sides of her family, her mother's family and her father's family, just have a long list of folks that are actors, political figures, artists. In fact, her mother was a relative of Joel Chandler Harris, who was the author of the Briar Rabbit stories. Some of you very well might be aware of those. Her father was Charles Edward Smith, who was actually the son of a former mayor of Brooklyn, Cyrus Porter Smith. He himself was a merchant and somewhat well-to-do. Her mother, who she got her initial first name from, Corinne Colman, brother of the painter Samuel Colman, was an amateur actor as well as an avid theater goer. It would seem that Pamela's mother, Corinne, was older than her father. You see, Corinne, in this case, Pamela Colman Smith's mother, seemed to have a very fluid age when she would record them in various records. The age difference between her and her husband fluctuate between 5 years and 11 years. All we know is that Pamela's mother was definitely older than her father was. It would seem that just because her father was a very well-to-do and busy person, that the majority of Pamela's young life, which was pretty standard at the time, was spent with her mother, and it was through her mother the love of art and an appreciation for those who create art was first fostered. Pamela and her parents lived in London for the first 3 years of her life, but then the family eventually settled in Manchester, a little bit further north. Not too much is known about Pamela's early life. She remarked at one point that she had gone on several trips before she was the age of 5, which, you know, nowadays we've got airplanes, etc., etc. But a child going on lots of trips, or as the term that she used, voyages, before the age of 5 would have been a little bit different. Her mother made a couple of trips to Jamaica when Pamela was quite young. We're not too sure if that was for vacation or just to visit family or things of that variety. As mentioned earlier, her father was a merchant, mostly dealing with textiles, to be specific, things like silk, and there was some trouble that occurred at the business that he worked. He wasn't the person that set up the business. It was a larger company, but he was indeed the highest person on the payroll there. There was some business problems and some competitors, and things went a little bit hairy for Pamela's father, Charles. What eventually happened is that he ended up taking a totally different job, wherein he moved himself and his family to Jamaica when he got a job with the West India Improvement Company, which was a firm that basically handled all of the economic and financial expenses of the main railroad builder within Jamaica. Pamela would have been, I believe, 10 or 11 years old at the time, and the family was, of course, located in the capital city of Jamaica, which would be Kingston. Something that has been made note of, particularly by a couple of the authors that I grabbed as resources for this episode, is this idea of outsiderism. That would have been an aspect of young Pamela's life, and which would extend into her adulthood. Pamela was seemingly always never at a place that was considered to be home. And while her father did indeed take her on trips to New York or to Brooklyn specifically when they lived in Jamaica, it would only be for brief visits before they would go back to their home in Kingston. Something that happens to a lot of folks that always feel somewhat untied to a geographical root system is sometimes people grow an innate sense of imagination, otherworldliness, and romanticism, and even one wherein they seem to create an identity for themselves because it's almost as if they feel like they don't have one. And so they're just constantly telling stories about themselves to others when they ask, and just in general creating a kind of personal mythology, which is entirely maddening to people that try to understand their lives at a later date. Pamela is a textbook example of this. The amount of mythology that has accrued around the things that Pamela was supposed to have done or why they did certain things was something that started pretty much almost from her teenage years all the way until the month following her death. Pamela has always seemed like somebody who was creating something of themselves always. In a sort of way, their life, or what they would tell others about their life, was an ongoing fiction, a work of art unto itself. Another aspect of Pamela's upbringing that certainly needs to be mentioned is that fellow who seems to have his finger in so many spiritual pies through the ages, and that would be the one and only 18th century mystic Emanuel Swedenborg. You see, Swedenborg's ideas, otherwise known as Swedenborgianism, was a big thing on both sides of Pamela's family. She was seemingly born into the ideas of Swedenborgianism. In fact, it was her maternal grandparents that were the single largest U.S. publishers of Swedenborg's books and materials throughout the 19th century. Swedenborg is indeed an incredibly interesting figure, one in which I've done a whole episode. I think he's beyond fascinating and well worth looking into for everybody. As far as Pamela is concerned, it also in a way affected not just the way that she approached the world and seemed to pierce the veil, if you will. Swedenborg's psychic abilities, or at least stories of his psychic abilities, as well as the books that he would write about visiting different planets and seeing visions of heaven, must have certainly played a huge role in Pamela's life. And it also went to Pamela being seen by relatives on both sides of her family that she, Pamela Colman Smith, was in some way gifted with what was called second sight, is that she could see events not tethered through time. In short, she was clairvoyant. And not just that, she was constantly being told that she was clairvoyant, and she certainly seemed to believe this, and this was something that she carried with her throughout her entire life. Swedenborg, but more specifically those who were followers of Emanuel Swedenborg, influenced Pamela so far as she was shown specific artists and specific works that were tied in with Swedenborgianism. The most influential of which, relating to young Pamela Colman Smith, was the illustrator, painter, and author of young children's material, Howard Pyle. His books mainly were about things such as King Arthur, Robin Hood, and others. These days, Howard is mostly known for the illustrations he would do relating to stories that he would write about pirates. You see, they didn't have photographs back in the day, at least not when pirates were around, and so Howard would draw from his imagination what he thought pirates would look like. You know that image in your head of a pirate right now, looking somewhat flamboyant? Well, that is because of Howard Pyle. Pamela not only loved the illustrations that Howard Pyle would do. Indeed, if you were to look them up on any search engine, you will see a certain amount of influence in Pamela's work. But also, and this comes through in a lot of the letters that we still have from Pamela Colman Smith, that there was a story that he wrote called The Garden Behind the Moon. I'll be quick with this. What this story does, and Pyle said that this story was a Swedenborgian tale, is it imagines a different kind of afterlife, one behind the moon, where an angel takes us and it resembles a kind of very nicely manicured garden where we're just meant to spend the rest of our time after we die. As I said, this story was very influential to Pamela through most of her life. We have letters where she would talk about important people who had died in her life being taken by the moon angel. It's hard to tell whether she's saying it jokingly or if she's saying as if she's actually believes that this is her idea of the afterlife. For my money, it kind of seems like up until a very seminal moment in her life that I'll touch on a little bit further on in the episode, I think she was being sincere about this. I don't think that Pamela accepted the particular kind of European Christianity's version of the afterlife, and I think that Howard's version in The Garden Behind the Moon made more sense to her. All in all I have to say is, no matter where you go as far as the Western esoteric tradition is concerned, Emanuel Swedenborg is not far away. When Pamela and her family found themselves in Jamaica in 1889, they went into a country that was, to put it lightly, enormously troubled. It was a very stratified society, and while slavery had been officially ended in Jamaica 50 years earlier, one wouldn't be able to tell. The vast majority of the population were, for the most part, indeed the ancestors of slaves from Africa. It goes without saying that they held a fraction of the amount of wealth that was being monopolized by the almost insanely small minority of white people that lived there at the time. What's more, there were people that were it's terrible to say, but I'll say it, that were imported from South Asia, mostly from India, to work on the sugar plantations there. Everybody at the time there, besides the people that had money, the white people that had money in Jamaica, were being exploited. And although, and I want to stress this, although Pamela and her family were definitely not poor when they were in Kingston, Jamaica, it does seem that due to the fact that, again, they weren't from Jamaica and they weren't from England, that they were in a way excluded in a lot of ways from the higher or highest echelons of the society in Kingston at the time. Pamela always seemed different. And as a young girl, she never really fit in, nor did she seek to want to fit in. And yet we do have letters written from a somewhat early age. This is pre-teen age, wherein she voices frustration at being not invited to balls and outings like the other girls were invited to. What we can't say for certain is that for the 5 years that Pamela was situated in Kingston, Jamaica, she was certainly very fascinated by the culture of those who had been the ancestors of the slaves brought from Africa. She seems to have been very enamored with the dress of the local women, the religious dancing, the loud, moving, boisterous music, and even some of the more public displays of African diasporic religion. What we have from letters that survived from this period of time, again, on and off in Jamaica between 5 and 7 years, is again this kind of struggle, this tension that we have with her seemingly enjoying some of the aspects in being in a place as other as Jamaica would have been, but also a kind of prudishness. We have her complaining that there's no kind of theaters of any good reputation. One major thing that we can glean from most of the time that Pamela was in Jamaica is that she spent a considerable amount of time just by herself. Add to this that for quite some time, Pamela's mother was ill, which would necessitate Pamela being at home, helping the servants of the household, and just generally caring for her ailing mother. What also occurred in and around her teenage years is a bit confusing because at the age of 15, while she was apparently still living in Jamaica, but also taking trips back to New York City, is that she was enrolled in the Pratt Institute, a secondary school for art and design. It's a bit uncertain as to whether or not she was still just living in Jamaica and then spending prolonged periods of time going to this school. And then when she'd be done school, she'd go back to Jamaica, but Jamaica was listed as her primary residence. All we can know for sure is that apparently she was a very good student, and the person that was in a way her mentor thought very highly of her art and drawing style. She seemed to be a little bit more mature than other students, and that generally it seemed to be a somewhat positive direction for young Pamela. Unfortunately, she never graduated from the Pratt Institute. Pamela was only 18 years old when her mother, Corinne Coleman, passed away from a prolonged illness. It was in a letter to one of her cousins that she mentioned that her family had been visited by the Moon Angel, hearkening back to the story that she had read in Howard Pyle's The Garden Behind the Moon. It should be fairly evident that the death of Pamela's mother affected her greatly. She seemed to be a very powerful and motivating force within Pamela's life. It also seems that Pamela was, during a period of time while she was caring for her mother as well as while she was attending the Pratt Institute, she herself was battling an illness or several illnesses on and off for a period of a couple of years. We're also not entirely sure why she left the Pratt Institute. It could be that they let her go due to her attendance and just not attending as many classes as they would like, or if she had a disagreement with her main mentor there at the Pratt Institute, who actually, in the only instance that he talks about Pamela Colman Smith, I believe in 1901, says that she was a very fine artist. And while her artwork was deceptively simple, it was very good work. I'm just actually going to veer for a second here. We have some of Pamela's early artwork, and it actually is quite good in that way that it definitely seems almost cartoonish and very simple lines, but it's got this very flowy element to it, and you can tell that she was also somewhat influenced, and because she mentions that she was influenced by Japanese mokohanga, which is a form of woodblock printing, as well as ukiyo-e, which is a very distinct kind of Japanese ink painting. Most likely it was her mentor's influence in showing her these kinds of art that had a huge influence on Pamela's early artwork. It's very good, and it seems somewhat almost fully formed. You can tell in her later work that it's just a bit more refined, but the artistic talent is there. It's very palpable. Again, podcasts, the worst ways to talk about visual artists. And not a lot of Pamela's work is available on the internet to look at. You kind of have to grab a book. There's a book called Pamela Colman Smith, The Untold Story. It'll be in the show notes. It's one of the best places to see a lot of Pamela's artwork. They did a very good job of snatching up and displaying as much of Pamela's artwork as they could in that one. But yes, she left the Pratt Institute without getting any kind of degree, and she was on the hunt to try and look for perhaps another mentor or perhaps another kind of influence. And she went with somebody that I have talked about previously a couple of times already, and that would be the artist, illustrator, painter, and author Howard Pyle, who was also, coincidentally, teaching art classes as well as taking on students. And with her father, Pamela took a trip to visit Howard Pyle in Philadelphia in hopes of attending his classes. I believe the school was called Drexler, but that she was able to get an appointment with Howard Pyle very easily. And she had this initial meeting with Howard and showed him her sketchbook, of which Howard said that she had fine work and even used the words ingenious. From all accounts, it sounded like a fantastic meeting, and Pamela was meeting one of her heroes, one of her major influences, and it looked like things were really starting to come together for Pamela, and that she would be accepted as a student with Howard as her mentor. It never came to be, and there's a couple of reasons perhaps why this happened. One being that maybe the requirements for her to attend this particular school were a bit advanced for Pamela at this young age. I believe at this time she was only 19 years old. I've heard there's also a story that one of the requirements to get into this school was that she had to submit 3 nude paintings, including one of the male nude body. And that was just something that wasn't done by female artists. So perhaps there was an element of that that good old-timey Victorian sexism. It was really a shame, though, that Pamela was not able to be taken on by Howard, by one of her heroes. But it didn't sound like Pamela was mad about it. It just seemed like just another one of those small setbacks in Pamela's life. She would pick herself up again, dust herself off, and basically go her own way. One last thing that I would like to note here about Howard Pyle and his influence on Pamela is that he was not just a painter and an illustrator, but he was also an author, somebody who would write and tell stories as well. And that was something that was probably perhaps the greatest influence on Pamela. She would, in and around this time, begin to do that very same thing that Howard had done, to write, illustrate, and release stories all on her own, just as Howard had done. Pamela returned with her father to Jamaica, where she would continue to work and continue to do things. One of the major projects at this time, and something that a lot of authors of biographies of Pamela will allude to, is a series of stories called Anansi stories. They were Jamaican folk tales involving the Akan trickster folk figure Anansi the Spider. I will have a little bit more to talk about this Anansi stories a bit further on in the episode. What I must make clear, though, is that the period of time after the death of Pamela's mother and leading up to the year 1900, although Pamela did not complete her studies at the Pratt Institute, she was constantly working and actively producing quite a lot of her own work, not just things that would stay in sketchbooks, but real projects that were being released by publishers. She was young too. You know, they did things differently back then. She was not yet even 21 years old, and she was producing a great deal of work. As always, it was an uphill battle for Pamela, not only being young, but also being a woman, it was difficult for Pamela to be able to advocate for herself and get paid properly for her work. The publishing firm William H. Russell was one of the major publishers of a lot of what Pamela did that would sell some of her artwork or sections of stories from the books that she would produce to newspapers and children's journals. A lot of letters survive from Pamela to friends and family members, just basically being like, these people aren't paying me, or I expected to get this much out of them and they only gave me this much. It was really hard, but it did not stop Pamela from continuing to work and continuing to produce. But more than anything, continuing to evolve as a better artist with each and every project. In 1899, Pamela and her father took their first trip back to Europe. They went to England for the first time since they moved from Manchester to Jamaica. This was to try and get Pamela's work into many more people's hands. It was not as successful as either wanted, but she did make some very fantastic connections. The greatest and most important of which would be that she met many of the dominant individuals involved in the Lyceum Theatre Company. This was due to an earlier acquaintance with one of the main actresses of the Lyceum Theatre Company and somebody that she would spend time with while she would be visiting New York, Dame Ellen Terry. Pamela had actually earlier illustrated a book about Ellen Terry that would be authored by somebody I am just about to mention. You might be familiar with their name. Ellen Terry would become a lifelong friend of Pamela and eventually would be the one to give Pamela her nickname. That would be her nickname and how she would be known by quite a few people later on in life as Pixie. It was through Ellen Terry that Pamela got to meet and became quite close with two major figures within the Lyceum Theatre Company. One being the owner and head of the Lyceum Theatre Company. That would be Henry Irving. And finally, a very important figure who was actually the manager of Henry Irving. That would be one Bram Stoker. Everybody should know that name, right? Bram Stoker. He wrote Dracula. While this trip back to London was probably not the most successful for Pamela, both her and her father remained very optimistic, and it certainly seemed that while financial success had eluded Pamela quite a bit, she was getting paid for some work, but probably not enough. It could certainly be said that Pamela's career was in the ascendancy. She was making a name for herself. Things were looking great for Pamela Colman Smith in 1899. That is, until on December 1st, while taking a trip back to visit family in New York City, Pamela's father, Charles Edward Smith, died quite unexpectedly and young at the age of 53. Pamela was basically on her own, an orphan at the age of 21. Pamela was quite lucky in the sense that she had a very close relationship with both of her parents. Her father was, again, very, very supportive of everything that she did, as was her mother. And to lose both within the span of 4 years must have been astoundingly devastating. Feeling entirely untethered to Kingston, Jamaica, and at the insistence of her friend and in a way soon to be surrogate mother, the actress Dame Ellen Terry, Pamela packed her bags and moved back to England in May of 1900, where she would live out the rest of her life. I know some of you might be like, all right, where's the magic? When are we going to start talking about magic? When did the tarot card stuff start to come in? This is it. But first, I want to highlight for a second the nickname that Pamela would be known for quite a bit over the next decade, the first decade of the 1900s. And that is, of course, Pixie. Again, it was given to her by Ellen Terry. And it truthfully very much suited her. As most folks that are aware that have listened to my series, A Fistful of Fairies, that I did a couple of years ago on the podcast, this is the period of time in which the somewhat romanticized aspect of fairies and the other folk, as well as the interest in the more occulted aspects of reality really start to get cooking. Of course, the last quarter of the 19th century, things like spiritualism as well as theosophy are very much a going concern and hugely popular through seemingly every class, at least within Europe as well as North America. Remember when I said that Pamela was considered a bit of an outsider, a bit of an other? Well, this is where her identity really starts to come into itself. Over the next 10 years, Pamela would be an incredibly enigmatic figure and someone who almost every person that met her just could not put a finger on whether or not she was sincere, being silly, whether she was from Jamaica, whether she was a mystic and a clairvoyant, or indeed people actually literally wondered whether or not she was an actual fairy. Pamela took to wearing scarves around her head. She would dress often very interestingly, almost like her interpretation of a Romani person. For my 2 cents, I think that she was very much influenced by the illustrations done by that gentleman I mentioned earlier, Howard Pyle, particularly his illustrations of Robin Hood, but most particularly here is illustrations of the pirates. Those two were based on a very romanticized version of the Romani people. That's why Johnny Depp looks the way he looks in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Again, the look of pirates is basically all down to one person, and it is Howard Pyle. Anyhow, if you see photos of Pamela Colman Smith at the time, and there's not a ton of them, and a lot of times they are very much staged, so you know that Pamela is really playing it up. She very much looks like somebody who wants to not only stand out, but stand in that area of both, I'm going to say, racial ambiguity, but certainly portraying somebody who is in some way a mystic or a living fairy tale character. In the biographies that I read of Pamela for this episode, and a lot of the letters that we have of people talking about Pamela to other people talk about her in a way that's kind of like they're mystified by her. They're not too sure where to place her. And quite a few of them also, in a way, talk down about her because she's just so fucking weird. She's one of those people that even the bohemians and those who were living the artist's life would have found like even too strange and too out there for them. Which, I mean, for us looking back now in the Victorian age in the early 1900s, it wouldn't be hard to do, but it also has its upsides and its downsides, as we shall see. Once Pamela arrives in England, she took a ship with those three individuals from the Lyceum Theatre, including Ellen Terry and Bram Stoker. She would eventually find herself living in London with Ellen Terry and her children. Ellen would indeed continue to refer to her mainly as Pixie, and it sounds like right from the outset, as soon as she's back in England, in London specifically, hanging around with all of these theater people really allowed her to play up the Pixie persona. She became a part of the Lyceum Theatre once she arrived in England, and she would tour with them, doing various things, helping with costumes, as well as doing set design, and also, at one point, doing illustrations that would be sold as a special collector's item pamphlet for people to buy once a performance from the Lyceum Theatre was done. The art from these pamphlets is pretty special. It's pretty good stuff. And at the time, actually, folks were very hyped on who's this interesting young artist that are producing these booklets, these Lyceum Theatre booklets. While she was in London, here's something that I haven't mentioned, but it is worth mentioning at least now, is that Pamela's father actually knew the father of William Butler Yeats, the wonderful Irish poet and member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and just all around a very fascinating and interesting individual who, no doubt, at some point, I will do an episode on William Butler Yeats. Everybody should know this person, right? Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot see the falconer, things fall apart, their center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed and everywhere. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Come on, we should all know William Butler Yeats. Anyhow, Pamela's family was familiar with the Yates family, and while she was in London, Yates was there as well, and they started up a friendship, and it was another one of these lifelong friendships that Pamela would have. That certainly helped her. At least, I say lifelong. I will mention it a little bit later on, but Pamela kind of dropped off the map for the last 20 years of her life, and she didn't really hang out with a lot of her older friends. I'll get to it, but for the most part, Yates was a good friend and one who would help introduce Pamela to a lot of folks within London, a lot of poets, a lot of artists, and for our purposes of discussion here on the What Magic Is This podcast, also a lot of magicians and occultists. A lot of these folks would actually be brought to a studio that Pamela had set up for herself. It was a bit of a boho gathering spot. It had a bit of an open house feel to it, and Pamela would do a thing that I'm going to talk about it a little bit later on, as it is a bit contentious, but she would dress as a Jamaican woman, would sit on the floor, and she would regale a lot of the folks that would come to her studio with stories of Jamaican folklore, as well as the Anansi spider stories. She'd really play up the Jamaican persona, but she'd also, in a way, intersperse a lot of these stories with her own kind of fairy tales and folk tales. She really enjoyed telling stories in a very theatrical way. One thing in her studio, though, is that she had a kind of mini theater, that she had a lot of cutouts of certain figures and certain characters, and she'd, in a way, I mean, to us it seems like really boring, but again, this is before television, and people got their kicks in many ways, and so Pamela would use this kind of miniature theater and the cutouts with them and tell stories for the people that would come to her studio for their weekly open house nights. Apparently they were very well received. People quite enjoyed going to them, and a lot of times people would be quite perplexed by this person, called by all of her friends and acquaintances as Pixie. One other thing that I need to mention about these gatherings is that every once in a while, apparently it was not a consistent thing, but every once in a while, Pamela would impress people with her clairvoyant skills. Of course, she would be very theatrical about it, and it would apparently suitably impress a lot of the people that would attend. And a lot of those in attendance would also be people that would be either spiritualists, theosophists, or members of an order that was kind of a big thing at the time, called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Even though Pamela was, of course, very busy with these open house bohemian get-togethers, as well as helping out the Lyceum Theater, she was always working on her art. And a lot of her friends within London would remark, particularly the person that was, in a way, a bit of a surrogate mother for her, Ellen Terry, would remark that she was incredibly fast at what she did. She was very meticulous about the detail of the things that she was drawing, but she could also do it very quickly, and apparently her output was just incredible. It astounded everybody. Her friend, the aforementioned William Butler Yeats, was very happy with the kind of work that Pamela did and actually asked Pamela to do some illustrations for something that he was publishing. Eventually, the friendships that Pamela had begun to cultivate with such people as the actress Florence Farr, as well as earlier friendships with folks such as William Butler Yeats and Bram Stoker, this inevitably led Pamela to join the magical, mystical order that was set up in 1887 in London. And I am referring, of course, to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which Pamela Pixie Colman Smith joined in 1901. I wish that for the sake of this episode that I could say more about Pamela's time with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. We don't really know too much about her involvement. There's not too many letters in which she mentions her involvement in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. But what we do know, and certainly the things that we can say, is what we know about the Golden Dawn itself. And in 1901, we were looking at a, as we call it back home, a Hurton unit. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn at this point was deeply fractured. As an organization, I believe at this point, MacGregor Mathers had sole control over the Golden Dawn, but he was running it from Paris, so it wasn't even in England. He wasn't even in the UK at the time. Add to that all of the shenanigans involving the acceptance of Aleister Crowley into the order, as well as a couple of American con artists who had basically taken some documents and papers from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Anyways, as I said, Pamela Colman Smith, by the time she finally joined the order, it was things weren't looking good. Things were actually starting to fall apart, and it was evidenced by just all of the members and the things that they were writing to each other. And yeah, things were certainly falling apart. We do not know why Pamela decided to join the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. I think it's most likely just because she had always been interested in the other side of spirituality, things that were not Protestant Christianity. She enjoyed some of the African diasporic religions in Jamaica, as well as certainly her Swedenborgianism. But I also think part of her knew about Hermeticism in some way, or at least the what was considered to be Hermeticism in the late 19th century. She began a practice in 1898 of signing her name with her initials, PCS, but she has them intertwined on a central rod, very much like a caduceus, that being the staff that was carried by the Greek god Hermes. In fact, if you look at your pack of Waite Smith tarot cards, I'm going to call them, for this episode, the deck is the Waite Smith tarot deck. I honestly don't give a fuck about Rider. I don't care who published it. Anyhow, every time you pull out one of those tarot cards, you will see Pamela's signature on it. So go ahead, grab them out and take a look. And yeah, you'll see that her signature indeed looks like a caduceus. All of this is to say that I think that Pamela was drawn into things out of the ordinary, and particularly things of a spiritual nature that weren't entirely within the vein of pure textual Christianity. Again, remember, she is, at this point in 1901, she is still very young, 23 years old to be exact. And I think that also she was somewhat impressionable. And for the most part, I think when all is said and done, the main reason that she joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was just with the people that she surrounded herself with. The people like William Butler Yeats and Florence Farr, Bram Stoker, and a few others. She, I think, joined because her friends were already there. Just like every other member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Pamela had to choose a magical motto. In this case, hers was, is everybody ready for some really shitty Latin from Doug? Here we go. Quod tibi aid alium, which of course because yeah, we all know Latin, right? Which translates to what is to others is to you, which in layman's terms, that's basically the biblical golden rule, right? It's very on point for Pamela, but also it's pretty funny because the magical mottos, there's a list of them on Wikipedia, or at least a lot of them that we know. I'm going to share some of those because some of them are just super pompous. There's like, I will rise again, or wisdom is a gift given to the wise. From the depths to the light, through fire to the light, strongly and rightly, I never retrace my steps. And here's Pamela coming in here with, you should probably be good to other people because you'd want it to happen to you, right? So there you go. I don't know why I affected a Canadian accent there, but I just did. There was a little slice of Canada for you, bud. It must be said, however, that she never ever got above the second grade, so she never got beyond going up just one level from novice. I believe the term is she was a zealotor, but for the most part, it doesn't seem like she was overly interested in the kind of things that the Golden Dawn got up to. Yeah, as I said earlier, I don't think we have any letters of her talking about what went on in the Golden Dawn. None. We don't have very much information. Apparently, there's going to be a book coming out in the next little while that goes through what Pamela got up to while in the Golden Dawn. It's called The Pixie and the Sorcerers, The Untold Story of Pamela Colman Smith Tarot and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn by Carolyn Dyson. It's not out yet. I don't know if it's ever going to come out. But for the most part, I don't think that the Hermetic Order was exactly Pamela's thing. It seemed pretty rigid for the most part, and that was kind of not Pamela's bag. She seemed a bit more of a free spirit and just kind of like doing her own thing, and to have to do these kind of things to try and jump through hoops in order to, get closer to the secret chiefs. It just doesn't seem like Pamela. Then again, what do I know? Anyhows, most likely she wasn't a big member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn because she was doing other projects. As I said, she was always working. One thing that she was doing at this period of time is she was actually doing illustrations for a suffragette group within England, specifically within London. For those who don't know, women's suffrage refers specifically to the women's right to vote, and a suffragette was somebody who was a member of the British Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. They were trying to get the word out and to basically hold politicians accountable in order to get votes for women. This is the early 20th century. Women were still not allowed to vote, in England at least, right? Pamela did a lot of volunteer work for the suffragette movement. She did a lot of illustrations for suffragette pamphlets and newsletters and things of this variety. And by the way, for those who don't know, it wasn't until 1928 that all women were allowed to vote in England. So less than 100 years ago, everybody. Jeez Louise. But yes, Pamela was a very active suffragette, or at least we just have more evidence of her being an active participant in the suffragist movement. Certainly more so than the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, although, of course, one of the rules of the Golden Dawn is kind of a bit of secrecy. Might be one of the reasons we don't know too much about her time in the Golden Dawn, but what also occurred in 1903, there was a major fracture within the organization. Those who wanted to stay loyal to one of the founders, MacGregor Mathers, they formed this splinter group called the Alpha et Omega, being run out of Paris, I believe. Then there was the Stella Matutina that was being run by Pamela's friend, William Butler Yeats. And then there was the original group, the Isis Urania Temple, which would have been the name of the original Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn Temple within London specifically. And that was being run by one gentleman who is in some way responsible for the reason that I am talking about Pamela right now. And I'm, of course, referring to Arthur Edward Waite, who was a U.S.-born poet, scholar, as well as mystic. Pamela decided to stay with the group that Waite had control over. Again, that was the original Isis Urania Temple. Waite would later change the name of this organization to the Rectified Rite of the Golden Dawn. And there were some major changes. I'm not too sure what Pamela thought of them, if she cared or not. I think it probably would have been a little bit more her bag as far as just the kind of way that she approached things. But it was more mystical than magical. There was less onus on having to do the things, the steps that the Golden Dawn had to try and go up grades and things of that variety. But even this, we have no idea, for the most part, what Pamela was doing, if she was even attending meetings or things of that. It's just, we really don't know. But what we do know is that the reputation that Pamela had as being a clairvoyant was seemingly something that preceded her, and it was something that the head of this new splinter faction of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Arthur Edward Waite, took notice of. That's where I'm going to leave it as far as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn stuff and Pamela Colman Smith. The splinter faction that she was a part of was disbanded in 1914. Who knows what she was doing with it until that time? Probably not very much. Let's rewind, or at least try to stay at that year I mentioned, 1903. It was during that year that Pamela did what, all young people like doing. She started her own magazine, and this was called The Green Sheaf. What can I say about this magazine? Well, it's lovely. It's very, I'll just say, very charming, very cute. Pamela does basically all of the illustrations in it. There's poetry, there's stories, but more than that, Pamela's illustrations are the reason that this little magazine it was something worth checking out. It had 13 volumes produced from 1903 to 1904. In the show notes to this episode, I will have a link for you to check out every single one of them online, digitally. Yes, the internet's not dead. There's still some cool stuff there. You just really have to go looking for it and wade through the fucking AI nonsense. Yeah, it's a fun magazine, and from a unique personality for the most part. There was contributors, people such as William Butler Yeats and Cecil French, even George William Russell, who went by the pseudonym A.E. Interesting fellow. He was a contributor. Yeah, there's some interesting people that gave some of their work for Pamela to put in her magazine. I think it's a very cool thing, and it's something that if you like the tarot deck and you like some of the other projects that I'm going to bring up that Pamela had a hand in creating, it's a bit of a small miracle unto itself, a female dominant and run magazine in a period of time when women didn't really do that. As mentioned, it didn't really last very long, just over a year. It didn't really make Pamela any money, unfortunately, so she decided to set up a press, and she called it the Green Sheaf Press. Didn't really do too great either, although it did produce work all the way up until 1906, mostly by female poets and female authors. All one can say about the first 6 years of the 20th century for Pamela was busy. She was kind of a person to know. Her little boho gatherings in her studio were still going on all the way until about 1907 or so. Always working, always illustrating, doing pamphlets for the suffragettes, always honing her craft. And I'm going to have to step out of the timeline for a little bit here and explain another aspect of Pamela that leads us to perhaps one of, if not the major artistic accomplishment of Pamela's whole life. According to Pamela, she had synesthesia. And for those of you who do not know what that means that she can, when she hears music, she can see certain colors, or in Pamela's case, she said that she could visualize certain scenes. They would come to her immediately when hearing certain kinds of music. I want everybody to know, because some people don't know that this is actually a real thing. This is a real thing. It's a neurological condition. The whole music and colors thing is just one aspect of it. There's different kinds of synesthesia, but it seems that Pamela had for quite some time an ability to visualize scenes when she heard music, and they would come to her very vividly. According to her, she had her first synesthesic, I hope that's a word. I'm going to go with it. She had her first synesthesic vision in 1900. On Christmas Day, she was over at a friend's house, and this friend decided to head over to the piano and play some music for Christmas, and so they decided to play some Bach. Apparently, as they were playing this music, Pamela had a vision. This is how she describes it. A shutter clicked back and left a hole in the air about an inch square, and through it, I saw a bank and broken ground. The smooth trunks of trees with dark leaves across from left to right came dancing and frolicking little elfin people, with the wind blowing through their hair and billowing their dresses. The picture was very vivid and clear, of beautiful color with bluish mist behind tree trunks. I drew an outline in pencil of what I saw on the edge of a newspaper, and as I finished, in perhaps a minute, the shutter clicked back again. According to Pamela, this synesthesia would follow her for the rest of her life, and certain types of music would give her true inspirational visions, which then she would paint. She tells a story that in 1902, she would attend these concerts in London that were done by a conductor who happened to be one of her friends. And while she was in the audience, as she would hear music, she would start sketching the things that she was hearing. And then apparently people were complaining about the sound of her pencil. And according to her, that one concert, she did something like 30 sketches, which she would then go and paint later. Also, according to her, and this is all her words, that 1 week she went to 5 days of concerts. She produced 94 sketches that she would then turn into paintings. I have to make it clear for folks that this experience, or at least the way that Pamela describes it in a few places, for Pamela, this was near automatic in the sense of automatic writing or automatic drawing. The synesthesia was so great for her in the sense that it gave her these really true visions that bordered on either coming from some part of her subconscious, or for her, she'd said that in a lot of ways that the figures within them were elfin or fairy people. I think the whole experience was something that was very important to Pamela, and she was leaning into a kind of artistry that was new to her and she found very, very exciting. Indeed, she has described when she would have these experiences from listening to music and then doing the sketches, or at one point apparently people complained that she was using pencil when she was in the audience, so she switched to doing like a little ink brush sketch so it wouldn't make any noise. But she was doing something very unique and something that was leaning into that mystical side of her that certainly I think had some kind of key to the true artistry, I think, of Pamela Colman Smith. She described her visions when she would have them from hearing music as going to a beautiful country. She would describe a lot of the times the background or the landscape of where the visions would take place would seem very beautiful, calming, but also very, very alluring. And this is something to keep in mind for, again, when I talk about her tarot deck. And while the tarot deck may indeed be the thing that Pamela is known the most for since she has passed away, indeed the collaboration that she had with Waite on that tarot deck, it is another person, another man who basically gave her the thing that she was known for the most while she was alive. And that person is Alfred Stieglitz. Alfred's name is not very well known these days, not unless you are a huge fan of photography. He was an American photographer. He was born in New Jersey. He's one of those people that really, really wanted photography to be taken more seriously as an art, at least as a medium that an artist can share their work, their personal art. He's also known as being the husband to the famous painter Georgia O'Keeffe. Anyhow, in the early 20th century, he had a somewhat infamous, at least to us now, infamous gallery called Gallery 291, which would display a ton of photography in the way that, say, paintings would be put in a museum or an art gallery or an exhibition. For the most part, the photographs would be of a more avant-garde nature. It wouldn't always just be Alfred's art. It would be art from up-and-coming photographers, people whose lenses and photographs Alfred deemed worthy of his gallery. And up until 1907, for the most part, it had been exclusively for photographs. That is until 1906, when who should walk through the door of the Gallery 291, a young and somewhat brazen, I might add, Pamela Colman Smith with her portfolio, which she showed to Alfred. There was a wide variety showcasing almost every aspect of Pamela's work, but it was these paintings that Pamela would do of the visions that she would get from listening to music, what she would call her music paintings, that mostly intrigued Alfred. And so it came to be that for Gallery 291, the first non-photography exhibition to be held there would be 72. That's a number to keep in mind, right? Anyhow, 72 of Pamela Colman Smith music paintings would be on display at Alfred Stieglitz's gallery. Apparently, the show or the exhibition had a bit of a slow start, and then it eventually started to get popular, more so after a critic from the New York Sun came to the exhibition and had this to say about what he saw. He's talking about Pamela Colman Smith here. I quote, "Her paintings reveal the workings of a strangely organized imagination, poetic in the accepted sense it is, and something more, sometimes unearthly." He then proceeded to drop a lot of names of famous artists, people such as William Blake, Aubrey Beardsley, Edward Munch, as well as Odilon Redon. High praise indeed. For the most part, the show was quite a success. Quite a few of the 72 prints sold. Stieglitz was, of course, a photographer, so he would take pictures of the paintings themselves, and those would be sold in a platinum print portfolio book. I believe the show went on tour to a couple of places, Pennsylvania being one of them, but also that he exhibited the paintings once again in 1908 and then once again in 1909. It could very well be said that this exhibition at 291, as well as the work of Alfred Stieglitz, really got Pamela's work out in the open. She was being talked about in magazines and newspapers. Critics were going to her shows and saying somewhat positive things because her art was being embraced in her country of citizenry, which is the United States, more so than where she was living at the time. Again, England. She had to take trips for a couple of years back to the United States in which she would be interviewed and she'd talk about her artwork. Pamela seemed to be at her peak. Allow me to just take a second here to talk about her music paintings. If you think that the artwork in the tarot deck that Pamela made, the Waite Smith deck. And let's say this episode has piqued your interest like a little bit more. Like perhaps you'd like to see a little bit more of Pamela's work. You have to check out the musical paintings. They are, some of them, incredibly similar to the kinds of things that Pamela would put on her tarot designs. I think they're absolutely fantastic. They're, in a way, almost like the work of, indeed, one of my favorite artists, somebody that I've given an entire episode about of the podcast. That would be William Blake. They're very much in the vein of the kind of things that you would see in William Blake, particularly his things like his landscapes, or at least the landscapes within the background of his artwork. More so than any of the artwork produced by Pamela up until this time. With these music paintings, although the only thing that they have in common with each other is the way that they were made, the how of the paintings, i.e. something like the visions from listening to music, from all of the musical paintings that I was able to find through various books. And Pamela's style seemed to be pretty locked down at this point, a kind of flowing to the figures and forms within the picture frame itself. I must say, trying to find all of the paintings that were put in this exhibition are hard, if not impossible at this point. I have not been able to find a book that has all of them. There are a couple of books that have, a good handful at least of these musical paintings. But yes, they're just exceptional and for the most part, fantastic artwork, in my opinion, and certainly a great representation of Pamela's genius outside of something like the tarot cards that we know so well. If anybody knows of, a book that was released that's got these, please let me know. But yeah, these musical paintings, they're not easy to come by. Now, most likely, even before the last time that the musical paintings were put in as an exhibition at the Gallery 291, Pamela had been in conversation with that fellow from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Arthur Edward Waite, about a specific one-off project that he had in mind. In a letter written, I believe, in November of 1909 to Arthur Stieglitz, this is what Pamela had to say. I've just finished a big job for very little cash. A set of designs for a pack of tarot cards. 80 designs. They will be printed in color by lithography, probably very badly. She goes on to say in this letter that once they are completed and printed, that she would send some to him as a present. She also remarked that some of the original paintings or the original drawings that she did that would be used as these tarot cards, she would send to Arthur Stieglitz so that perhaps he could put them in his gallery and perhaps he could sell them for her, to make a little cash. She says, I quote, this might just be, the understatement of the century within the occult and Western esoteric realm. She says, I quote, some people may like them. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is literally all we have of Pamela Colman Smith talking about her most infamous work. Just this letter. This is all we have. So as mentioned, most likely Pamela had started work on the tarot deck, or at least it was in the brainstorming phase in and around 1908. She had about 5 months to do the entire project, which, as I said, included 80 separate illustrations. As she mentioned, it was done very quickly and done with not a lot of money. As far as the history is concerned with this deck, I've actually already done an episode called A History of the Tarot, in which I go through some of the more minutiae elements of the deck. Don't worry, everybody. I will talk about this tarot deck. I would just like to get Pamela's story out there first, and then, of course, I will return to it. But if you want the timeline as far as, when certain things happened and when it was first released, please listen to my History of the Tarot episode. It'll be there, and a link to that episode is in the show notes for this show. As far as Pamela goes, after the exhibitions that would be at Alfred Stieglitz's gallery, things did not go great for Pamela, at least as far as her artwork and its commercial viability. She would continue to help volunteer her works for the suffragettes, yet spiritually things were changing for Pamela, and I think that her collaboration with Waite had a lot to do with this. See, Waite was more interested in mysticism than he was with what we can call magic or ritual magic. And again, when he made the shift in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn to a kind of mysticism as opposed to magic, this was probably something that Pamela took to heart a bit more. This seemed to be something that she was more interested in. And while Waite himself was not a Roman Catholic, no doubt the mysticism and more mystical aspects of Roman Catholicism seemed to appeal to Pamela. That, as well as quite a few of her friends, were Catholic also. One of the resources that I have for this episode tends to think that her conversion to Catholicism was something that began probably even before she met Waite, and most likely she was taking steps to convert to Catholicism while she was working on the tarot deck itself. And again, I want people to understand that this dichotomy between magic and the occult, bad, and that of institutional Christianity, good, is a very simplified way of looking at this kind of stuff. I think that for Pamela, her conversion to Catholicism, which she did in 1911, wasn't a renunciation of her occult interests and her appeal of mysticism. I think for Pamela, going from what she was before with the Swedenborgianism and all of the fairy stuff to Roman Catholicism was a very natural progression. It would seem from correspondences that we have later on in life that Pamela was a somewhat pious Catholic. She was still situated in London, of course, and apparently she was still doing her weekly meetings at her studio. But in April of 1914, in a visitor's book that she would get each person that would come to her weekly gatherings to sign, she herself wrote in this visitor book, "I don't care for people anymore." Of course, there would be a lot of conjecture as to what this actually meant, but it seems like this signaled the end, perhaps, of these weekly meetings, but it certainly signaled the end of getting people to sign this book. One wonders if the tone is of a misanthropic one, that she just doesn't care for people anymore, so she doesn't want people around at all. There is a letter that we have which belonged to the sister, Lily, of William Butler Yeats, that says, I quote, "Pixie is as delightful as ever and has a big roomed flat near Victoria Station with black walls and orange curtains. She is now an ardent and pious Roman Catholic, which is added to her happiness but taken from her friends. She now has the dullest of friends, selected because they are Roman Catholic converts, most of them, half-educated people who want to see both eyes in a profile drawing. She goes to confession every Saturday, except the week that I was there. She couldn't think of any sins, so my influence must have been very holy." It seems that after her conversion to Roman Catholicism, Pamela was as busy as she had ever been. Quite a few major projects were undertaken and completed, including the illustrations for Bram Stoker's last novel, The Lair of the White Worm, produced in 1911. She also actually had a major exhibition in New York, which was for the Berlin Photographic Company, trying to, in a way, recreate the success of her Gallery 291 exhibitions. She did illustrations for quite a number of published fairy tales, including Bluebeard. And finally, something well worth mentioning is that she produced over 100 illustrations for a book which was aimed at young adults called The Book of Friendly Giants, written by Eunice Fuller. Then things start to change, and of course the change happens around an event that was entirely out of Pamela's control, and that would be that World War I broke out in July of 1914. Apparently, Pamela actually, during this period of time, during the First World War, would make children's toys that were to be sold at a bazaar in central London. Commercially, she was not getting very much work, but it was during the years of World War I. A lot of illustrations were being used for various groups related to the wartime efforts. These, of course, she was doing out of charity. Towards the end of World War I, Pamela received a substantial sum of money from one of her relatives, her uncle in New York, and she used this money to lease a property called Park Garland, which was a large house with 2 additional buildings and 2 acres of land on the Lizard, which is a village in Cornwall. For those who don't know, if you know the island of Britain, at the bottom-most southwest part of that island, that's Cornwall, and there's this little bit that kind of sticks further down as far south as one can go. In England, that's where Lizard is. So she had property there. Apparently, she had gone on trips with her uncle to this place in England, and she loved it, so she decided to get out of London at the end of World War I and live there. Apparently, it was a place where a lot of artists would take themselves. They would like to get down there for the fresh air and just to be a little bit away from all of the crowds. And apparently, she fit in like a glove. But it is at this point after World War I that we know less and less and less about what Pamela got up to. As I mentioned, she had several buildings on her property. And one of these buildings she would actually use to lease out to Catholic priests that were traveling through the area. She would accept money from them, and she tried to use this separate building to get some kind of income, because it seems that she wasn't really getting very much income from her art at this point. It seems after the horrors of World War I, the kind of symbolic illustrations that Pamela in a way was so enamored of, and which gave her a name and a reputation, were extremely unpopular. And her art by this point was almost nothing. It is quite sad to go through some of the correspondences that we have towards the end of Pamela's time in the Lizard in Cornwall, as every single letter that we do have from this period of time just states how distressed she is about her finances. She apparently had a small little farm with poultry at her property as well that would probably help her with some of her meals. She also had a longtime friend by the name of Nora Lake move to her place in the Lizard to help with running the vacation home that they would have for these Catholic priests. Some biographers seem to think that her and Nora had a love relationship, that they were a lesbian couple. Obviously, it wouldn't be public. I don't really know. I can't really say one way or the other. There's nothing really that we have from her letters, or at least nothing that to me really shows what kind of sexual proclivity Pamela would have had. Of course, she was a somewhat private person, and of course, even back in the day, with her being even a slightly public figure as well as a public artist, that she would keep a lot of cards, if you'll excuse the pun, keep her cards close to her chest. I'm not too sure. Part of me just thinks that Pamela was more asexual than anything. It appears that both her and Nora would exchange books, and they'd write in the books kind of little fun pen names or nicknames to each other. It is clear that her and Nora had an intimate relationship, but I don't think it ever really, or at least it just doesn't seem to me like it ever really tipped into the sexual side. I think at this point, more than anything, because we do have evidence that she was a very pious person, she'd attend church whenever she could, she'd go to confession every week. I think that her Catholicism was probably the largest arbiter of any kind of decisions or actions that Pamela would take in the last few decades of her life. Due to her financial hardships, in 1939, Pamela had to move away, first to a town in Devon called Exeter, and then eventually in the 1940s, Pamela moved back to Cornwall, although to northern Cornwall, to a place called Bude. The last 20 years of Pamela's life is one in which her artistic, commercial ambitions have all but fallen away, but she never stopped drawing. We have sketches that she'd done. A lot of times these sketches have religious overtones, but in the way that, William Blake's work had religious overtones, they were still fairly distinctive sketches. Things like angels, but they just don't look like, the cute angels with wings and a long flowy gown. Her artwork around the last 20 years of her life still looks very much like Pamela Colman Smith's work. The last 2 decades of Pamela's life, we have letters that basically mention some kind of illness, probably something to do with her heart. Luckily, her friend Nora Lake was there with her and moved with her to Exeter and then to Bude as well to help care for Pamela. She was financially very, very poor in the last decade of her life. She was probably a bit of a wreck too because in and around where she lived in Cornwall during World War II, it was a place that the German Luftwaffe would bomb quite frequently. The final years of her life, she was renting a single room on the second floor of a house. And on September 18th, 1951, a neighbor and friend who would come in and help the somewhat bed-bound Pamela with chores and things of that variety walked in to find a lifeless Pamela in her bed. She was 73 years old and still astoundingly poor. And the level of poverty is very apparent because her last wish was that all of her possessions and everything that was of any value be given to her friend, Nora Lake, but that she was so crushingly in debt from everything that her final wish was not to be. Everything was taken by the debt collectors. Nora got absolutely nothing. Pamela could not afford a plot in which to be buried, so her final resting place is probably at the St. Michael's Church in Bude, Cornwall, in an unmarked plot. And just like her entire life, which was surrounded in a kind of mystery and mythology, even after she died, there were stories about Pamela, including one that she was so unhealthy and so overweight by the time that she died that her body could not be taken out of the room and that they had to destroy a window in order to get her body lowered down to be taken to the morgue. Most likely this isn't true because one of the things that the debt collectors incurred after Pamela's death was a charge for the destruction of a window. Most likely that was to be able to get furniture out of the room and had nothing to do with Pamela's general health. What we do know, because Pamela was so far into debt, is that even after everything of values of hers had been sold, it was only enough to pay off about 20% of the debts that she had by the time of her passing. After World War I, Pamela Colman Smith seemed to slowly fade into obscurity. Her art came to mean less and less with every passing year. I can only speak for myself, as I would like to call myself an artist. That is indeed a fate worse than death. And yet, Pamela did not suffer this fate at all. Now, before I jump into talking about the reason that I'm talking about Pamela Colman Smith today, there's a couple of small little nitpicky details that I just have to go through. One of them that I did go through for the History of Tarot podcast episode that I did a couple of years ago. I don't want to go over it in full to be beating a dead horse in any way, shape, or form, but it is something that is worth mentioning, at least on an episode dedicated entirely to Pamela Colman Smith. It is something that I see over and over and over again. I understand why it happens. It's just, I really think it's time for us to speak honestly in a big way about Pamela. The thing that I mentioned on that episode is, of course, there's this idea that Pamela was half black, that she was half Jamaican. This is not true. I went into it. She's not. Her families are, from what we understand, exclusively white in every way. I will say, though, since doing the research from that episode, History of the Tarot, to this episode about Pamela, there's like a slight chance that someone in her family might have been from Jamaica on her mother's side, but it would not be enough for her to claim some kind of Jamaican ancestry. For all intents and purposes, Pamela lived, at least in the first 20 years of her life, very much as a white European person. So yes, people are starting to get this right. I still see it, but I see less of it, that Pamela is talked about as being, people will put up, the person that created your favorite tarot deck is half black. I don't see that as often as I used to, but what I also do see is that a lot of folks will be championing Pamela's work, particularly some of her stories like the Anansi stories and her performances, her Jamaican folktale performances, as being, very, very positive and helping make people aware of the culture in Jamaica and just making folks at the time more aware and less racist about people from the West Indies. I think it could possibly, there is an essay that is in a volume edited by former guest of the podcast, Amy Hale, in the Palgrave Studies in New Religions and Alternative Spiritualities, Essays on Women in Western Esotericism. The essay itself is called The Myth of Pamela Colman Smith's Blackness, Ethnic Impersonation in the Modern Esoteric Milieu by Thea Worsting. In this essay, and I'll just save people from having to buy it. I mean, if you can buy it, definitely buy it. It's very expensive because everything from Palgrave is expensive. Anyways, they're worth it, but they're expensive. Anyhow, this essay, it basically outlines a few of the things that Pamela did, one being the things that she would publish and illustrate, the Anansi stories, and another volume that dealt primarily with Jamaican folk tales, as well as the performances that Pamela would do of telling these folk tales, as well as the things that she would wear, as well as how she would speak when she would be sharing these kinds of things. And I think what Thea is getting to in this essay, and it's not what I think, it's what she is getting to in these essays, is that for the most part, Pamela wasn't really pushing for racial equality with the way that she approached these things for the most part. Now it seems kind of horrific for us to imagine, but it might have been a little bit more of the time itself, but Pamela really leaned into the ambiguity of her race to the point that she used it in a way to sell herself, as well as her performances. Pamela certainly didn't really move the bar as far as racial equality is concerned. In fact, a lot of her writings and her performances certainly would be in line with the racist attitudes of its time, 100%. No matter which way you look at it, Pamela's performances and the things that she portrayed as far as the aspects of herself, which she passed off as being non-white, were common, but to us now very gross impersonations, which would definitely be racially insensitive. I believe the term that one could use is painfully narrow. While it would have been the norm for the day, we can certainly, in retrospect, look back and just see that Pamela was really not as groundbreaking as far as a lot of folks currently in this contemporary occult milieu would have you think. Pamela was very much a product of her time, and that's about all we can say for it. She didn't really push anything forward as far as racial equality is concerned, and a lot of times, particularly in her portrayals and particularly in her live performances, was sadly, standardly racist. Not only does the myth of Pamela Colman Smith being half black have to be dropped, but this idea that she really was a trailblazer for African American racial equality has to fall away as well. It is something, though, that's part of Pamela's story. It is an aspect of her, and certainly one that we need to acknowledge. In summary, there's a lot of things to applaud Pamela for. Representations of folks from the West Indies via Pamela is not one of them. In March of 1910, William Rider and Son Limited of London released a pack of divination cards simply called the Tarot that could be yours if you send away for it for 6 shillings. For that price, you would get 72 cards as well as a book called The Key to the Tarot, written by Arthur Edward Waite. The back of the cards featured a design that in a way looked like dried, cracked mud. The color was a light brown, but if you were to flip the card from its back to its front, what would become immediately apparent is the bright, contrasting colors that you would see. Since March of 1910, these designs, these illustrations on the front of these cards, in some capacity, has never been out of print. While the publishing company, William Rider and Son Limited, had produced the cards from 1910 to about 1939, and then again from 1971 to 1977. These designs have had a hell of a journey. Allow us to talk about the Waite Smith deck, the tarot deck, which has changed absolutely everything. The artwork, the project that has allowed for Pamela Colman Smith to join the echelons, not only of the Western esoteric and magical tradition, but I would say Western culture in general. If there is a tarot deck, this is it. What more can we say about this deck that hasn't already been said in 100 podcasts before this episode is dropped? The answer to that is, I think, quite a bit. There's, of course, the details, the facts, and the things that we know, but there's also some other things, some aspects of this deck that are well worth knowing. And particularly, I would say, the designs. We're talking about Pamela Colman Smith. I think a large part of the success and the endurance of this set of divination cards is because of Pamela Colman Smith and her art. They, in a way, have a life of their own. There's nothing that you can do to this deck that seems to be able to stop its popularity. The original drawings are gone. We have no idea where they are, if they were destroyed or thrown away, if Pamela had them by the time she passed away, or if she gave them to somebody else. We have no idea. The original plates for those original designs were completely destroyed during World War II. The designs themselves were ripped off by a notorious company. There's just some people and companies that just delight in ripping off other things. And it was the DeLawrence company, an American publishing company, that basically completely ripped off the designs of the Waite Smith Tarot in 1916 and continued to publish it. Again, these designs have never, ever gone away. And part of that is because of the DeLawrence Publishing Company, who stole the designs in 1916. A lot of times these cards would be colorless except for one major color. They'd be black, white, and either yellow orange, or the most popular of these pirated decks, which were red, what I think lasted from the 60s to the 80s. 20th century occultic and mystic Paul Foster Case and his magical orders, the Builders of the Atium, they used these designs by Pamela Colman Smith. They used the Waite Smith deck as their official tarot cards. They would actually come with some of them, not all of them. There's examples. It'll be in the show notes. You can find a great website, actually. Waitesmith, all one word, .org. Head there. It's just the coolest website as far as this deck is concerned. Anyhow, the Builders of the Atium, that whole magical order, their deck would also come with a Kabbalistic Tree of Life on there, that Kirscher tree there as one of the cards. Just follow along. Look at all the tarot cards. They all map into the paths and things like that. Anyways, the whole point I'm trying to make with this is that while the cards went through a period where they were not the most popular thing ever, the designs on the Waite Smith tarot cards, since the period of time of Pamela designing them and them being put onto cardstock, from that point forward to right now, has never gone through a year. 365-day span not been at some point, whether officially, i.e. legally, or not, in print. Is this luck? Is this just laziness? Is it like, okay, there's not a lot of tarot cards around, let's just keep producing this one? I actually truly think that there is, or to be specific, there are reasons that this deck continues to persist. And while this is an episode about Pamela Colman Smith, I feel that I have to take a little bit of time here to talk about the person whose name originally appeared on this deck when they actually started to put names on this deck, and that would be Arthur Edward Waite. We don't really know how often Pamela and Arthur Waite met to talk about what was going to be on these tarot cards, whether they would talk by telephone, which was possible at the time, and apparently Pamela did indeed have a telephone in her studio. They didn't live exactly close to each other. I believe Waite at this point lived about 8 miles north of Pamela. We really don't know too much about the collaboration between Pamela and Waite. We have nothing from Pamela's side, so the person who tends to dominate the narrative as far as the construction of this tarot deck falls squarely with Waite. Before I share some of the words as far as what he thought about the construction of this tarot deck, firstly, we need to understand that at this point, Waite is very much making the transition, or he has already made the transition, of falling out of love with the ideas of magic, at least Western ritual magic as promulgated by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and he is really starting to double down on things like Freemasonry, Christian mysticism, and things of that variety. He still has in his back pocket, he still has Agincourt de Gébelin, as well as the words of Eliphas Levi, an author whose works were translated. The 2 books were translated by Arthur Edward Waite himself. But we start to see with Waite the chipping away of Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn type of magic towards a more mystical, and dare I say, broad symbolism, which, if you have eyes to see, is very much represented on a lot of these cards, particularly the tarot trumps. More on those later. As far as how this deck came to be, again, the words are entirely Waite's at this point. We don't really have too much about Pamela and how it all came to be. How many of the things on the cards are expressly, for the most part, entirely Waite, and how many of the cards are expressly almost entirely Pamela, or if it was all a huge collaboration, we don't really know. But what we do have are the words of Arthur Edward Waite, and this is what he said in his autobiography, Shadows of Life and Thought. I'm going to read a rather large section here. Of course, the emphasis will be entirely mine, and that emphasis is going to play in largely through the voice of somebody who is a complete Victorian sexist asshole. Here we go. Here's what Waite has to say about the whole situation as far as this tarot deck is concerned. I quote, "Now, in those days, there was a most imaginative and abnormally psychic artist named Pamela Colman Smith, who had drifted into the Golden Dawn and loved its ceremonies, as transformed by myself, without pretending or indeed attempting to understand their subsurface consequence. It seemed to some of us in the circle that there was a draftswoman among us who, under proper guidance, could produce a tarot with an appeal in the world of art and a suggestion of significance behind the symbols, which would put on them another construction than had ever been dreamed by those who, through many generations, had produced and used them for mere divinatory purposes. My province was to see that the designs, especially those of the important trump majors, kept that in the hiddenness which belonged to certain greater mysteries, in the paths of which I was traveling. I am not, of course, intimating that the Golden Dawn had at the time any deep understanding by inheritance of tarot cards, but, if I may so say, it was getting to know under my auspices that their symbols, or some at least among them, were gates which opened on realms of vision beyond occult dreams. I saw to it, therefore, that Pamela Colman Smith should not be picking up casually any floating images from my or another mind. She had to be spoon-fed carefully over the priestess card, over that which is called the Fool, and over the Hanged Man." End quote. So yeah, I mean, this tone, while it's fairly common with Waite, and one of the reasons that I'm not a fan of anything that he has produced for the most part, the kind of sexism and just looking down on everybody, particularly women, was fairly common for the time. Yes, we need to understand this. But for the most part, it just basically says that, particularly with the Trumps, and this seems to be true, particularly with the Trumps, a lot of what is there is indeed because of Waite and his understandings. And again, as he mentioned in that paragraph, his shift away from like what he thought was dumb surface level occult meanings of these things to this greater mysteries, these vaster realms, i.e. things like Freemasonry and Christian mysticism. And he talks about, the cards that he had to apparently spoon feed the details to Pamela Colman Smith, including the priestess. By the way, if you look at the priestess card, if you get that card out and you look on them, there's two pillars on there. One of the pillars has a B on it, and the other pillar has a J. Here's the crazy thing. Not a lot of people know this, so you're getting it here first. The B and the J, that stands for blowjob. I'm joking. It doesn't. That's really childish of me. I'm so sorry. No, it doesn't stand for blowjob. It actually stands for butt jelly. All right, I'm joking again. The B and the J, that's Jachin and Boaz. That's Freemasonry stuff. Anyway, that is what Waite, because he was putting a lot of significance into things other than ritual magic, European ritual magic, a la the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, to things that he thought were more important, or just the things that he believed to be more important. So I'm going to take, Waite at his word. And this is, for the most part, where I'm going to steer it back to talking about Pamela for what we can see, and at least from the words that Waite has put out there. The Trumps are the things that, for the most part, that is mostly Waite's major contribution. And he didn't really care too much about the other stuff or the images that were of the other cards, which is kind of crazy because those are the majority of the cards, the so-called minor arcana. What were Pamela's influences in this regard? Well, very obvious artistic influences were folks like William Blake. That much goes without saying, but there's these two other major influences for Pamela at the time in the design of this tarot deck. Both of these influences are pinpointed to a specific locale within London itself, and that is, of course, going to be the British Museum. The first of these influences is just a small one I'm just going to bring up and basically mention that there was a book that was in the British Museum, or at least it was on display in the British Museum at the time when Pamela would have been going there, called The Flower Book by the English 18th century artist Edward Burne-Jones. You see the illustrations in this book, of which there are 38 of them. They're actually specific watercolor paintings based on the names of certain flowers. A lot of the images are in some way biblical themed, but some of the other images are strikingly close to a lot of the things within Pamela's drawings. I think that due to the simplicity of these watercolors, that they certainly would be an influence on Pamela, or at least like bolstering her influences again. I think by the time that she got to doing the tarot cards, a lot of the themes and the way in which the pictures are presented share more with her musical paintings than the things in this flower book. But there are certainly similarities, and the similarities are far too striking for it to not be an influence on the things within some of the cards that Pamela herself drew. The major influence, and the one that we absolutely have to talk about, and for me, this is the key to not just how Pamela decided to approach the cards that she had more control over, but actually to the whole shebang, to its popularity, to why the images are the way that they are. This is it. In 1908 and 1909, at the time, in the British Museum, there were on display reproductions of a set of cards, the exact same kind of thing that Pamela would be making, and therefore, of course, she would have drawn the connection that, hey, that's what I'm doing. Time to pay attention. Pamela's not an idiot also, right? Pamela would have known that there were tarot cards around and that they would have been used as divination cards, particularly Itea. And of course, it's just across the channel, things like the Marseille tarot cards. Pamela did it right. And I think this was a conscious decision, because she would have known this, is that she said, okay, all of that other stuff, that's new, right? The Itea, even though he says that it's this from this ancient art and blah, blah, blah. And as far as the Marseille decks, even though those are very old decks, they're not as old as this other deck that I can see the pictures of here at the British Museum. And that deck itself is the deck that we know now as the Sola Busca Tarot. If you need a reminder, please head back to my History of Tarot podcast. I talk about this deck a ton, but one of the most important aspects of this deck is that this is the OG. This is the one. Like, this is basically, for my money, all roads lead back to this specific deck. It's a hugely fascinating one. By all means, if you have not read Peter Mark Adams, his book, The Game of Saturn, deals expressly with this tarot deck and some of the really interesting pagan mysteries that very well might have been squirreled away within these cards. Such thing could indeed be an entire episode unto itself. But anyways, I don't think a lot of the scholars that talk about this tarot deck really truly talk about the influence that this deck had on Pamela. And a lot of times they'll show, hey, look at this card. It's almost exactly like this card that Pamela drew. Look at how similar they are. And then that's it. It's just like, it influenced her. So she just kind of ripped off some images and put those images like somebody carrying, instead of carrying a ton of swords, they're carrying a ton of staffs. You know, it's very obviously that the images on these cards was an influence on Pamela. It needs to go deeper than that. I think it actually goes deeper than that, in the sense that Pamela understood the assignment. She knew about tarot cards. One of the most distinctive elements of the Sola Busca tarot cards from the tarot cards that came after it is that it seems, for the most part, that there is a lot of human figures on these cards. Not all of them, but pretty much the majority of them. That is, for the most part, one of the major, if not the major distinction from this very special tarot deck to the tarot decks that would come after the Solabusca. Pamela is not just copying the images. She's taking the prototype of a tarot deck that, in my personal opinion, had some very interesting mysticism and magic woven into the images themselves, which informed Pamela and influenced her to prioritize the humans, their activities, and what they are doing within these cards, and imbued them with a broad but purposeful mystery. This is it, I believe. This is, I think, the reason that this deck endures. Yes, there are so many people that like to have their 2 cents. Every single book that I read for this episode talks about why they think this tarot deck is popular. Yeah. There's human beings on it. Sure. Yes, the cards seem somewhat simplified. Okay, perfect. Yes, it has some symbols that are just deep enough to allow for people to wonder what they are and to allow for an interpretation during a divinatory reading. The colors, the backgrounds, they all look kind of pastoral. All of these things are true, certainly. But I don't think any of those things get there. I don't think any of this stuff happens. I don't think Pamela's deck becomes as important as it is if she did not see the cards of the Solabusca deck and make the connection that, oh, this is as close as we have here in this museum to the oldest kind of this sort of thing. And it's here, and I can see it, and it's lasting. I can do something with this. Now, one has to ask whether this is entirely purposeful, whether Pamela made this kind of connection inherently, or if it just over time became true. The cards lead me to believe that she knew exactly how to make these things appealing to us. I know for a lot of people, the major arcana or the 22 trump cards are the thing that get a lot of people interested in the tarot. For me, with the Waite Smith deck, they're almost an afterthought. I actually don't think that they're very good. The thing that always draws my attention are those minor arcana, those pip cards, and what those people in those cards are doing, the things that are around them. Pamela's drawings are a masterclass at simplicity in viewer participation. Take the whole divination aspect out of the cards. When one starts to put these cards down, particularly the minor arcana, they're immediately drawn in by the activities of the people on the cards, but also as far as what they are doing, but more importantly, where they are directing their attention. Where their attention goes, your attention follows. It is an incredible trick, and one that seems to happen on a subconscious level. It is a kind of trick of a certain kind of art that almost can't be taught in a way. You want to be involved with these cards, and in that act itself, you are synthesizing meaning, even without trying to draw some kind of omen or divination. For me, the greatest example of this, and something which was put forward by a scholar that really helped me put my finger on one of the most appealing elements to a lot of the cards within this specific tarot deck, is a trope, an artistic trope called the Rücken figure. The simplest way to try and explain what this kind of convention is it's just figures that have their back to you, the viewer, that in a way allow you to take part and participate in what they are looking at. It's a very, very simple way of doing things, but I would love to draw your attention. If you have these cards in front of you, just start going through them and start to realize how many times the figures in the cards have their backs to you. This was not a kind of thing that Pamela did exclusively for this tarot deck. It is something that she did in previous paintings of hers, particularly quite a few of what were her music vision paintings, her synesthesic paintings. But seeing as how quite a few of the cards within the Solabusca almost did the same thing, albeit not for the reasons that Pamela would do it. I am somewhat convinced that Pamela saw these figures within the Solabusca deck and basically said, oh, that's a lot like the visions that I had when I was hearing certain kinds of music and when I ended up doing the sketches from those kinds of music. They'd be absolutely perfect for some of these cards. Something truly must be said about the period in time in which Pamela had to do these drawings. She did not have very much time to do them. And the tight deadline probably just meant that Pamela had to default to a way of telling stories through pictures that had been almost second nature to her as an artist at this point. For me, it's these minor arcana that truly express the magic of Pamela Colman Smith. It's here in the overly simple, uncluttered scenes of a man sitting beneath a tree, staring at 3 cups while another cup appears from a cloud, held by a hand, vying for the attention of this person that seems not to notice. We're there with them. In a way, we don't see the miraculousness of what is happening just out of view. Something magical is happening every time one takes out these cards and flips through them. All right, I might have gone a little bit too broad there. I'm speaking specifically about a certain card, which for me is an embodiment of this entire tarot deck, and that is, of course, the 4 of Cups. If you're familiar with it, you know what I'm talking about. If you're not, have a look. But I think what I'm getting at is Pamela was, without a doubt, in my opinion, the perfect person to have done this tarot deck. I think that Arthur Edward Waite is doing a disservice to not just a fantastic artist who, according to him, had to be spoon-fed the meaning of these cards. I don't think that he realized just how great of a artistic project he received once Pamela finished her drawings. In a way, I'd like to say shame on him, because his folly is our joy. These cards are immensely popular. They are the go-to for a lot of people that do divinatory readings, and they are indeed the tarot cards for those of us here within the West. They are, as I've mentioned time and time again in this episode, a bit of a small miracle. The fact that this deck is so popular and that one can hold them in their hands and look at them and see something so utterly distinct, perfect, timeless, simple, mysterious, mystic, and certainly whimsical, and see attached to it some kind of magical umbilical cord stretching all the way back through the centuries to the first tarot deck is utterly astounding, and in this day and age, something well worth celebrating. I am glad to see Pamela getting quite a lot of credit, but I also think that we, as a society and as a culture, us continuing to use these cards, to engage with these cards, deserve a bit of credit as well. We're not silly. We're not foolish. We are eternally curious, wonderful, magical beings. And we know a great thing when we see it. There is so much joy in these cards. We should all thank Pamela for this joy. At this point, no doubt some of you might be like, well, you're talking about the Waite Smith deck when you're going to talk about, what some of these cards might mean or things like that. And truthfully, I don't think I have to. I think that these things, they explain themselves. There's books for that. There's so many books for that. In fact, this is my hot take, and it's not a very unique one, that basically almost 90% of the books about tarot that you can find out there are a ripoff of Arthur Edward Waite's book, A Key to the Tarot. It's almost every single one is basically just ripping that book off, or inspired, who knows. But if you read a key to the tarot or a pictorial key to the tarot, congrats, you've basically read 90% of the books that have been released since 1970 about tarot cards. The fixed meanings and the Kabbalistic correspondences and all of that stuff, at least to me, mean absolutely nothing when set beside just taking these cards for what they are. And in my opinion, they are an exceptional work of art and one of the most fascinating, simple touchstones of our Western culture. All that other stuff means very little. Take these cards and take the knowledge that you've learned today, hopefully, about Pamela Colman Smith, and really ask yourself, how is it that this thing became such a big deal? When I was younger, I attended a screenwriting class, a class where myself and a group of about 30 other students would sit and learn how to write a screenplay. I remember the very first class that we had. It's something that very obviously I've remembered to this day because I'm sharing it with you right now. The teacher asked us why we wanted to learn how to write a screenplay. And, we would go around the table. It was a large group of tables, all kind of smushed together. So we were sitting on the perimeter, kind of making a large square, if you will. And so we would go in turns, explaining to the others why we were in this class. Most of the times it would be that I love movies and I love writing and I want to understand how the thing that gets on the page, somehow how it translates to the screen, that sort of thing. But one of these students, he was a bit older than the rest of us. He said, I want to understand the formula. He said, I want to understand how a screenplay can make a great film. I want to understand the elements, the small decisions that exist on that page that, when translated to the screen, make it great. I know there are such things as great scripts that make great movies. I want to understand the formula, the equations that makes these things great. And at the time I was younger, so I just nodded along. I was like, yeah. Yes, absolutely. That is a very noble ambition. And part of that really was something that I took with me going forward in life, because as I mentioned at the start of this episode, I consumed a great amount of art, and then I wanted to understand the story behind that art. I wanted to understand, to perhaps do what this gentleman wanted to do, this other student. I needed to find the formula. How did it get there? The thing is that there are certainly decisions that can be made. You can certainly put certain mechanisms, certain little flashes of color, decisions, little things said, little things done, small increments of personal touches, universal touches, archetypes, and otherwise. These can all make for something great, a great work of art. But there's no standard. There's no formula. That doesn't exist. You have to trust yourself in the things that you're good at and allow for the circumstances and instances that surround what you are doing. Make space for all of them. And yet, strangely enough, I'm speaking personally here, I think that some projects, some art, somehow have an agency all their own. They have a spirit all their own. There is something about the story that needs us to pay attention to it, and it needs our attention. It feeds off of it to stay alive, to stay relevant, to stay both wanted and needed in our hearts and in our minds. Can the creator put it there, as in you, the artist? Is that possible? Does one breathe life into these things in some kind of fashion? This thought, more than any other, is indeed the thing that countless generations of artists and creators wonder to themselves. This is the question. Can I give this life to endure? And this is why magic is art and art is magic, because seemingly it happens all the time. What can you do? What can you do in the here and now? What things should you notice? Speaking as it is, as I said earlier, the first quarter of 2026, people are talking about art quite a bit these days, more and more. Without sounding too alarmist right now, I think it's fairly obvious that art is under attack. You know, one of the things that when I think about my art, when I think about this podcast being a long-form piece of artwork, each episode is a specific kind of painting unto itself. And I'm really trying to say this without being too fart sniffy. Something discernible is happening to how we understand and interact and understand the importance of this variety of magic on our lives. I'm sure every generation thinks this at some point. I certainly seem to think this time it's for real. This time is different than those other times. And I'm not sure what I can do from my end to make you understand that this is so. I know that a lot of you probably are on the same page. Each and every episode of What Magic Is This that I make, I attempt to, in a way, make it timeless. I don't want to tether any episode to a specific date. I would love each and every time that my show is listened to be an artifact that is not firmly planted in any one specific time frame. I would love for somebody to hear my show in 40 years. Perhaps I'm still here, perhaps I'm not. That they will understand what I'm trying to say and the anxieties and the issues that exist to them in that time are things that, while I would understand them, are unfamiliar to me right now. But that each show is approachable in some way, regardless of when they come to it. Yet there's something happening right now, currently, that requires a bit more attention, that requires you to understand in some way the meaning, the purpose of art to you on an individual level. I think back to that gentleman that wanted to understand the formula and the mechanisms that make art great. I wanted to look at the tarot deck that Pamela Colman Smith made. The things on there, the depictions, the stories behind the decisions. And while I don't understand why Pamela put them there, I understand as an artist myself that they made decisions. That deck is an accumulation of artistic decisions. Countless small artistic decisions. Pamela lived her life as an artist. She lived the artist's story, did she not? She went through a period of time of great struggle, trying to find herself. She made some decisions that future generations would look back on and say weren't the greatest decisions, but I still understand why you made them. She had some kind of notoriety for a period of time. She produced many, many things. She struggled and lived that struggle. And she unfortunately felt and lived the slow decline of being unknown and passing away in poverty. Again, the artist's story. At no point would Pamela not have considered herself an artist. I think there are lessons that I would like to share with everybody, and I would hope that many of you listening would be able to hear between the sentences here that I think it is truly important to approach not just your art, but your life as an artist. Abandon such things that keep getting said to you by a lot of people that aren't magicians. They're not like you. They stand outside of this great, wonderful, mystical circle. They are telling you that you are only as important as those that you influence, that you're only as good as the amount of things that you produce, and that the most important decision that you make is when you provide the next thing. This will not do. And I hope you feel this. I hope this is not something that one, to quote another great artist, grokks. I hope you, in some aspect, intuitively grasp what I am saying here. That as a magician, as an occultist, you're an artist. Your life and the things you produce are your art. I think it is high time at this point, right now, whether you're listening in 2026 or in 2078, that you understand the process via which one creates either of those things, your life or your projects, your artwork, are the consequences of you doing your best and small decisions all the time. Those decisions, despite how they might appear to you now, for the sake of convenience or any other, are important. They are not frivolous in any way, shape, or form. If you have listened to my show just last week or for years, I would really hope that you hear my voice right now and understand that each and every one of those small decisions that you make are filled with life and agency and purpose. And this adds so much to our world. As I said, these days, it seems different. This time, it seems different. Something about us, something about our life and the way that we live is being guided towards something that is not full of life and agency and spirit. I opened this episode in talking about that kind of existential crisis of what happens once I or yourself die. That fear that some part of us will not be carried into the future in some way, that the voice no longer echoes through the ages. These days, it is becoming very, very apparent that death is not what's at issue. The opposite of life is not death. The opposite of life is the machine. The cogs and wheels of a deep-rooted materialism that tells us and snakes its way into each and every act that we make these days for the sake of itself and its own ideas to perpetuate. It has convinced so many of its innate righteousness, and it knows that it can convince many magicians and many artists that it itself is as inevitable as death. Your brushstrokes, your fingers typing, your words said aloud, your gestures, your magic can each and every day prove otherwise. Be as aware of your decisions as you can be. This is art, and it has a chance of being eternal. It's a fun game to play because nothing really lasts forever. Nothing's lost, right? Nothing's lost, but nothing lasts forever. To play the mental game with oneself, as far as, the last 100 years, that's how long this tarot deck, designed by Pamela Colman Smith, with input, obviously, from the person whose name adored these packs from almost the very beginning, Arthur Edward Waite. How much longer are these tarot cards going to be popular? Is there a different set of tarot cards, perhaps, that will take their place? Because I think, tarot cards, they've been around for 500 years. I think they have at least another 500 to go. But what about this specific deck, right? What about this one? How much longer is it going to be, up there in the ranks? How much longer is this going to be the deck? Chances are, I think they're very good that this one's in for the duration. I don't think Pamela's artwork is going anywhere. What I am very, very delighted to see go away is the fact that Pamela's name wasn't on this deck. That has disappeared, thankfully. This deck is no longer known as the Rider Waite deck. Pamela, her work, her art, her name, some fragment of her soul cannot be stripped off of this thing any longer. I'm not the best at foreseeing the future. I mean, I do have something right in front of me right now that that might be able to help with that in some way. And my daughter has eaten a rather large part of the corner of this box of tarot cards. But I think more than anything that the other names are going to fall away. I think if there is one thing that is going to slip into obscurity, is the name of Arthur Edward Waite. I think that the generations to come after us are going to have to be remembered, to use his words, under proper guidance. That's still quite a ways, though. What about you? What about me? What about all of us? What's going on? What can one say to further enhance this episode that has been a little bit, slight on the magic, more so on the personality and on art? Well, it's quite easy. Yeah, it's quite simple. For one, if you're interested in magic and the occult and you're familiar with these cards, perhaps have a pack of them somewhere stashed away, get them out. Play with them. If you've never interacted with these cards, everybody else has them. You don't need them. Get yourself a deck. Take them out. There's lots of editions of them. Some of them very faithful to the original decks, or what are called the A deck, the first purchasable Waite Smith deck. Some are very, very close, not exact, but you can find them. You can buy them. There's a lot of decks out there with the name Rider deck or Waite Rider deck, Rider Waite deck, Waite Smith deck. There's so many different varieties, but just get yourself one. Bring them home. Spend some time with them. Invite them in. They're a friend. I think there's a spirit here. I think there's something about these things. Spend some time. Flip through those major arcana, and then I'd say put them away. Your real friends are on those other cards, on the minor arcana. That's where the heart is. That's where the magic resides. And I want you to think about not what these cards could mean laid next to each other. That kind of stuff you can do with any deck. I want you to just take in these cards. Don't analyze them unless you really feel like it. Just allow for them to reintroduce themselves to you, to see their joyousness, the love, the attention, what's going on with these things. To see beyond, to see beyond the thing that Waite wanted you to see beyond, right? Despite what he thought, that stuff is the surface level stuff. There's so much here. It's rather beautiful. More than anything, I want you to really see the person behind this deck, this wonderful soul, this mysterious, strange, ambiguous artist by the name of Pamela. She has her place. She deserves her place. And that is why I have her here next to folks such as John Dee and other artists like Austin Osman Spare. She's worth knowing. And there's only so much that I can do from speaking and talking that can convince you that she belongs here. Her art should be able to do that. And so, if you have those cards, take them out and let them convince you. They're not going anywhere. I'm aware of the counter-arguments, and I'm very much aware of the nitpicky details that I'm sure that some of you would love to share with me about this episode. Keep in mind of words that I have and have not used. Perhaps you think I'm talking about something that I'm actually not. Perhaps there's a twinkle in my eye and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Or perhaps you think that I'm talking about something that I have no business talking about. All of these things may be true. All I can say for sure is that I feel so wonderfully anointed that some of you take what I do very, very seriously, and that I have a few hundred people that are allowing me to create this podcast. This is my artwork. This is my project. And so I have mentioned it on my Patreon episodes, but I feel I have to mention it here on the main podcast, that the reason that I can do these episodes and put them out and say some of the things that I say is because I have been so lucky to have people find my work and to like my work and to decide to support my work. It is the greatest feeling in the world. It is one that I sometimes forget at just how lucky I am. Part of me would just really love to talk to each and every one of the people that support me and ask them, why me? Why this thing? What is it about this that you have decided to want to help me in continuing? And I'm sure that would be a very, very fun thing to do, but practically that's that's not possible. So I can only do what is possible, and that is to just keep doing this, keep creating, keep putting this art out there. And hopefully some more of you decide to want to help me in doing this. So as we do with every single episode of the What Magic Is This podcast, let me talk about how you might be able to support me should you decide to do so. And of course, I shall just preface this by saying, if you do support me, I am eternally grateful. Your actions and deciding to help me in some way financially goes straight to my heart, and it just really touches me. So there's about 4 ways of helping me out here and to help keep this podcast going and to keep this as my job, my career, and to creating these episodes. And let's talk about the first way, which is something that I just mentioned right off the bat, and that is Patreon. Patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. I have one tier. It is $7. What happens when you pay that $7 US every month is that you get access to, at this point, well over 100 audio episodes and video episodes. There's a lot there. I have produced quite a bit of work. The kind of things that you will find on the Patreon are episodes about angels, spirits, and other entities, things of that variety. I have videos about how to create your own incense, set up an ancestral altar, draw a magical circle for use in such things as evocatory ritual magic, as well as other audio episodes about just things that are on my mind. But more than that, episodes about books that I think you, as an occultist and magician, need to read. There's even episodes there about some more in-depth dives on things like evocatory ritual magic, Solomonic magic, and Goetia. So what I try to tell people, and you've heard it time and time again on these episodes, is that it's basically a whole different podcast. We really get in there and start to discuss and look at some very interesting aspects of the Western esoteric, but more importantly, the Western magical tradition. And yes, as I said, it's only $7 a month. That's very little money in this day and age, and it gets you so much. And I try to, at this point, I try to have at least an hour to an hour and a half episode released every single month. Something else I say every time I do one of these outros is, personally speaking, I think it's my best work. The best things that I do are not here on this free podcast episode that you're listening to right now, but on the Patreon. I really try to push the envelope a little bit and provide a lot more in-depth information and give it a little bit of a personal tone and just really have fun and do something quite different with those episodes. So if you could see yourself to supporting me, by all means, it is the best way of supporting me is to just join the Patreon. Again, $7. That's very, very little. So how do you do that? Come on by, head to patreon.com/whatmagicisthis or head to whatmagicisthis.com and find any number of these support me on Patreon links there. It would be beyond appreciated. And yes, you basically are one of the hundreds that helps me continue to make these shows. Another way of supporting me is through PayPal. Head to whatmagicisthis.com. So many PayPal buttons there. Just click one of those PayPal buttons. You can send me any amount of cash. I'm not going to talk too much about it. Just kind of keeps the bills paid. Recently, haven't really been very busy there on the PayPal, but it is all well and good. I know people are strapped for cash these days, but yeah, it's expensive having a podcast. Got to pay a lot of. All of these things have like subscription model stuff now. I don't own any programs anymore. They all want you to pay every year, and it's expensive, and it's getting more and more expensive. So if you donate through, man, a lot of belly aching from me in this one. Anyways, if you want to support and keep this podcast going as far as its bills, best way of doing that is through the PayPal. Yeah, any amount helps. It really, truly does. $5, $10, $20, $200,000. Any and all donations are accepted there. And yeah, it just keeps the fires on here at the What Magic Is This headquarters. Another fantastic way of supporting me, which is something that also benefits you as well and also benefits independent bookstores all across the great United States of America, is to head to my online bookshop. Hey, have I talked about a book in this episode that you're like, you know what, I want to grab that. I want to grab Pamela Colman Smith, The Untold Story, because it's got so many of those wonderful illustrations that Doug talks about in this episode. I'd like to take that, but I'd also like to help the bookstore that is selling it, and I'd also like to help my favorite podcaster, Doug, as well. Well, now you can. I have an online bookstore. It is done through bookshop.org. So if you want to head there, head to bookshop.org/shop/whatmagicisthis or head to whatmagicisthis.com. Find any number of the online bookstore button links that I've got there, or head to the menu and you can find my online bookstore there as well. There are so many great books that I have listed there. Basically, 95% of the books that I talk about in any of my episodes are going to be there. It is organized by episode. So each and every episode that I do here for this podcast has its own little page that has basically almost every single book that I mention during that episode and some more books that are in the show notes. So yeah, what happens if you buy a book? The independent bookseller gets a little bit of it. The website, bookshop.org, that are doing a great service, they get a little bit. And also, I get a little bit of it. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing. I love books. I know you love books too. And I know you want to keep these bookshops around and kicking and thriving. So the best way of doing that, besides actually going down there yourself and buying the book in person, is to order it from bookshop.org or head to my online What Magic Is This bookshop. Also, it's just fun to scroll through. Head to my bookshop. Just look at all of the crazy titles that we have on there. It's bound to get you excited, and trust me, it's really cool to see all of the books and the sources that I have put up there. So that's a great way of supporting me as well. And the final way of supporting me is not one that is great financially, but it is just such a wonderful thing to see, which is if you wanted to grab yourself some merchandise, I have an online merchandise store that is set up through TeePublic. What happens is if you want to get a mug, a t-shirt, a tote bag, a throw pillow for your couch, even a wall hanging, iPhone case, or just phone case, or a laptop bag, any of those kind of things. There's more, way more. Hoodies, baby clothes, that sort of thing. What you want to do is head to whatmagicisthis.com, go to the menu, click on the menu, and then you will find the merchandise button. Head there, grab yourself something. I see very little money from it, but it is always awesome to see people in my shirts. Somebody just sent me a picture the other day. Loved it. It really is so awesome. And you know what's even better is even if they don't tell me and they follow me on Instagram, and every once in a while I'll just click on the stories when I'm, I don't know, sitting on the toilet or just trying to pass time. A little too much information there. But for those of you that stuck around and is actually listening to, for the 15% of you that are still listening to this segment of the podcast episode, there you go. A little too much information for you. But anyhow, when I see their stories and somebody will have one of them wearing my t-shirt, they're going to the gym or something like that, or just out having, I don't know, some hot dogs with friends or something like that. It's always like, it's such a wonderful thing. So if you feel like grabbing some merchandise, please head to whatmagicisthis.com, find the merchandise button in the menu there, and grab yourself something amazing. Grab yourself a mug. Mugs, I have got a few of mine. They're still fantastic. Love drinking out of them every day. I've got so many of my own t-shirts. I am indeed my own best customer. But yeah, definitely if you do grab yourself something, please send me a picture. I'd love to see it. But all of these things are to say they're a great way of supporting me, but the best way of supporting me is the first way that I talked about, which is through Patreon. Of course, that is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. A whole different podcast, my best work. So amazing. Or head to whatmagicisthis.com and find any number of the Support Me on Patreon links there. And once again, I would be absolutely honored if you were to find your way to supporting me on Patreon. Yep, I've said it a couple of times in this episode. One of the worst ways of getting to know an artist is to listen to a podcast. It's really not what they're, at least a visual artist, like a filmmaker or a painter or an illustrator or something like that. Is the podcasts are just the worst. Like all I can do is share a story and share some personal thoughts and some speculative ideas and perhaps my 2 cents about their artwork, which is exactly what I did in this episode. But truly, if you want to get to grips with Pamela Colman Smith, if you are already familiar with her tarot deck, is to find some of her artwork. There's not a ton of it on the internet right now. There are some books that certainly do have a lot of her illustrations, particularly that one that I just mentioned, Pamela Colman Smith, The Untold Story. Please head to the show notes for my website. That's whatmagicisthis.com. There's going to be some interesting show notes there. A couple of books that you can pick up if you want to know a little bit more about Pamela. But there's also and I haven't had a chance to look at it, but it looks very intriguing, a graphic novel about Pamela. It looks wonderful. I think Pamela would have absolutely loved it. Anyways, yes, not a ton of show notes for this one, but certainly a lot of book recommendations and some other cool websites to have a gander at as well. Again, her magazine, The Green Sheaf, I will have all of those for you to click on and have a look at. That is it for this episode. Part of me wants to apologize for this being a bit more of a pastoral, maybe pastoral is not the best word, preachy. You could call it preachy. I don't know. I care. I care about this stuff. I care about art. I care about magic. I care about the fact that they are so intertwined, and I truly believe that it has the capacity to change reality. I think that we are dealing with living, active beings when we interact and confront this kind of thing. This is not frivolous stuff that we're dealing with. And yes, if the If the little rant that I had here was one of those ones where it makes you just kind of tisk and be like, I don't think you understand, Doug, or maybe you're making a bigger deal out of whatever you might be talking about than you need to. I hate to say it, but I don't think you get where I'm coming from. And while that can be okay, I often wonder what brought you to this temple of magic, to this wonderful, wonderful place that I call my home. This is my universe. And you need to know that no matter what you're being told by others or what you think from the outset about certain things that are being pushed in front of you, that like any great artist and any great magician, it is the small things, particularly the small decisions that you make, that carry the greatest import. How you choose to conduct yourself as a magician and as an artist is the most important thing that you have going right now. I know you're brilliant. I know that you're luminous. I know you have done and will continue to do great things. Choose wisely. Okie dokie, folks. That's it for this one. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that this really makes you want to go out and enjoy a little bit more of Pamela's work. I know you want to find some more. I know you want to break out those tarot cards and just play with them. I don't care if you do divinations. I just think these are such cool cards. I think they're just wonderful. They're fantastic. While they might not be my go-to tarot deck, I still think that these are beyond worthy cards. Treat them like they are, which is a sacred, living work of art, just like you. All right, everyone. That's it. I hope you enjoyed this. Until next time, I want each and every one of you to stay healthy, to stay hopeful, and to stay luminous. Until next time, everybody, take care. All the best. Bye-bye.